lot of kids and one of my grandkids. Come on. And the grandkids are roaming up and down. Oh, well. Don't forget the two words of the day we had last week, because we're going to hit them today. But porneros, which is hurtful, and pistis. And pistis, never for pieces. But I have the word that we have had this word before. This is really an important word. But we haven't had it recently. And I don't know if we had it in Hebrews. But you'll recognize it. E-L-P-I. This is the declension. Elpidos. It's elpis. Elpis, which specifically, and I got the definition for you, it means to anticipate. Usually with pleasure, to anticipate. And it is and properly it's expectation. That is properly expectation, but it is translated as faith and hope. So, okay, I just want to mention this. I think this is a good point to mention. In Greek culture, Greek thought, are the words concrete or the euphemistic? Concrete. They're always concrete. As a matter, we're going to see this again. And, you know, I think the best example is this. We have sarx, psuche, and pneuma. And the problem with sarx, psuche, and pneuma is, well, we want to say body, mind, and soul, which is pretty good. I mean, I can go with that. But in our translators all the time, and we're going to see this, especially at the end of Hebrews. We may or may not get in there. But, right.
Wow, come on.
I mean, today. We won't necessarily get there today, but at the end of Hebrews 10, when we get into the end verses, the 30th, I think it's 39 is the last, but when you get to the end verses, they begin talking about soul. And for some reason, our translators love to translate psuche as soul. And psuche is probably the furthest you can get from soul, period. Although, you know, it gets complicated, right? Because psuche is the unintentional breath, or the unconscious breath, where pneuma is the conscious breath. So, very complex words. On the other hand, we have a word like elpis, right? And elpis, which means, we translate generally hope, which is a pretty good one, but it really means, it doesn't mean hope, it means expectation. Anticipation of something positive, good. But you notice, we have the word pistis.
Right. Why are they using that instead of pistis?
Bingo, exactly. And if we see it in our Bibles, and they've taken either elpis or pistis, and we know pistis doesn't mean anything like faith in our minds. It means to be persuaded. Elpis is probably closer to the idea of faith, but it means hope. And we think hope and faith are so different that we have different words for it. Just saying. So I think that's interesting. The other one is this one, which is a more complicated word. The O sound is the H-O, H-O-M-O-L-O-G-I-A-N. And this one you guys should all be able to figure out, or partially figure out. Anyway, homo, logios, logos, logios. This is logos, right? Logos. Logos is the argument, is an argument. And a homologes, or homologian, this is the declension, but homologia, basically homo means the same. The same. The same. The same logos, the same argument. Specifically, the word means to assent, to agree to. In other words, the homologious means that I am agreeing with your logical argument, or I'm giving you the same logical argument. It can have multiple meanings in Greek. In other words, I could mean either it's an assent. So you could give me a logical argument, and like Rick could give me a logical argument. And if both the logical arguments come to the same telos, right, then we would all assent. On the other hand, Dave might give me a logical argument, the same that Dave gave me, the other Dave gave me the logical argument. So I have two similar logical arguments, right, the same, and therefore I'm assenting because I agree they're the same logical arguments. You get what I'm saying? So homologious is interesting. The problem is that it's translated as confession or profession. This doesn't sound like a confession or profession to me exactly. Although a homologious could be, well, what do we do every Sunday? Our confession is the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, right? That is a homologious. In other words, we are in agreement of a... Matter of fact, the creeds are not necessarily a logos per se. They are a conclusion of a logos. So, interesting. Anyway, we'll see these words, and right now we are in 22. The problem with 22 is remember, we are... This is a deep dive argument, right? It's so deep dive that many times, and I've told you this before, we will see this more and more as we get toward the end of this chapter. But the more words that are in the Greek that are, you'll have the translator translating extreme words in Greek, or words in Greek in extreme ways. And we'll see that more and more because it's a very complicated argument. Yes, sir?
Since you're talking about the words and translation, I don't want to get way off here, but do you think, King James was done back in the early 1600s. Do we have better understanding of Greek now than they did then, and if so, why? I mean, are we just better at it? Did we find more documents? Is there some reason? I mean, would we have more faith in a Greek dictionary today than whatever they would have used back then? Do we just have more scholarship? I'm just wondering about the differences in why did they make these decisions about some words and not others, and would we have made them different today?
If we were to take scholars of Greek, of ancient Greek, of classical Greek or Koine Greek, and I'd rather have classical scholars than Koine scholars for the reasons we've talked about before. If we threw them in a room all by themselves with the Greek documents and said, translate them, I think we would come up with significantly different translations, not because we have better knowledge, but because what has happened, and people ask me all this time, why are translations not as good as they ought to be? There's basically three reasons. The number one is, we think a translation should be a translation, but what do you mean by a translation? The King James is almost a transliteration. A transliteration is, do I have a transliteration in here? No, I don't have a transliteration. I have a transliteration at home. I have a couple of transliterations. A transliteration is I take the Greek words and I put under them the actual translated words, and so I have one Greek word and one English word. And a transliteration, word for word, you would say, I can't understand this. This is totally not understandable.
It's a grammar, so right.
Right, because the way they form the Greek and the order of the Greek is so different than English. On the other hand, the King James is a semi-transliteration. What they did is they put the Greek, they rearranged the Greek to be in common English, but they translated almost word for word until you got to Hebrews. And then it broke down, seriously, because it's such a complex logos to tell us. The other problem is, that's one, translations. There are, and when I've taught my translation class, we've gone from transliterations to the opposite. The opposite is what we call a cultural or social translation. In other words, I take the words of the Greek and I try to translate them culturally and socially so a common modern person or person in that culture can understand it. So for example, if I'm translating into Islamic culture, I would say Allah, for God. If I'm translating for Japanese culture, I'd use the word kami, because that's the word for God, or kami-sama, that top God, head God. So when I do a cultural translation, I translate into your culture in such a way that the meaning is supposed to be the same. There's a serious problem with that though, right? As we've seen. The meaning in the Greek culture about sacrifice and about other things is foreign to our modern culture.
Right.
So when I translate to meet that need, I really lose a lot. So the NIV, which is supposed to be someplace, the NIV is, here's a literal, or transliteration, right? The NIV is someplace up here. It's not supposed to be a full cultural translation. The New English Version is supposed to be a full-on cultural translation. It still doesn't do a great job. It's better than most. But then I have the NIV, which is someplace on the 7 scale, right? The other thing is, that's number one, translation. Number two, if I've translated the word into English since King James, what happens when I try to sell you a Bible that uniquely and radically changes those words?
It's gonna rock your world.
You don't buy it. You don't buy it. So, like what happened with the American Standard, or when they came out, what happened when they first came out with the NIV? What did people say? You know, it says, it says, what did it say at in Luke 2, and the angels and the angels appeared to the shepherds and sang in chorus or whatever. I mean, the words, right? We knew of them. I can't remember anymore, but we used to know them in the King James, and they were musical, and they were, you know, almost like.
Because the angels are singing, and the NIV said sang.
And the NIV changed to say, because that's what it doesn't say they were singing, it says they were saying, see? And so when people read that and you lose the psalmistry, you lose the poetry that was written into the King James, which is interesting since it's nearly a literal, you know, transliteration kind of translation. And you go, what's wrong with the NIV, right? But I changed words, and as long as I don't change a lot, like for example, as I've told you before, the word, what's the Calvinist word? Not election, predestination. There is no word for predestination at all in the New Testament. The closest word to predestination is faith, pathos. There's no such word as predestination. The minute I pull predestination out of a Bible, though, guess who will never buy that Bible? Calvinists and Presbyterians will never buy that Bible ever again. And some Lutherans might not, because even though we talk about not believing in predestination, we talk about double predestination versus regular predestination. And it's like, dudes, what are you talking about? It's not even Greek. There's no Greek for predestination. That's faith, and the exact opposite of the message of the New Testament. There's another reason. And the other reason is your society, your culture and society, the translators in the King James era, the translators in the era of Rome, of Constantine. What did Constantine want the people to do? What was Constantine's reason? Okay, maybe he converted and he converted all the way, I'll give you that. But what was Constantine's reason, ulterior motive for converting to Christianity?
Keep the peace.
To keep the peace. He was having serious problems with those Christian guys because the Christian guys would not do what he wanted them to do. He was having problems, and it was what do you call it, social, they weren't opposing him like with fisticuffs and with you know, spears and fighting him. He was opposing them culturally. And so to make his empire culturally match or meet, you know, to be able to enact anything in his culture, he wanted the Christians to come up. So what's the first thing he wants in his translation into Latin?
You want them to pay their taxes without complaining.
That's right. Pay your taxes and obey your authorities. And so we get in Romans, which is a absolutely, totally mistranslated and misdone thing, this idea that you should, it says in Romans, pay your taxes and obey your authorities, which is absolutely not what it says at all in the Greek. But guess what Constantine wanted in there? Pay your taxes and obey the authorities. Bingo. Guess what King James wanted? Pay your taxes and obey the authorities. Wow, what a good one. Even though almost all of our legislature and our government is non-Christian and a bunch of heathen, immoral pigs, left and right and right and left. I mean, you have a few that may be moral, but most of them are immoral, ungodly, unchristian people throughout our whole government. But yet, what do they want? Pay your taxes, obey the authorities, right? This is why even it amazes me. It says in the Bible, Jesus said, you remember the coin?
Do unto Caesar, yeah. Give unto Caesar.
If you think that means pay your taxes and obey the authorities, you are not understanding at all Jesus Christ, the New Testament, the Greek, or what that means. Because when Jesus said, who does it belong to? In the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the answer is God owns it all. There is nothing you can give to Caesar. And so his answer was an irony, a Greek irony that basically told you, no, don't pay tribute to Caesar. But yet, for some reason, we have generations of pastors and teachers that try to tell you that's what it means. You got to be kidding me. Especially when in his trial, that was one of the things they brought up, was he told us not to pay taxes to Caesar. Yes, sir.
I think a big problem is that a translator or anyone who's preparing any kind of document has a tendency to want to please their patrons. That's good. So if I'm paying for the translation, I want the translation to look the way I want it to look. I think that's why the NIV appears to be a Baptist Bible, where they talk about the elements of communion being symbols rather than elements.
Yeah, in the notes or whatever, and especially, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing I get to, and this is why, literally, I've always wanted to do these kind of classes because I think the ability to look at the Greek and see what it really says, it shouldn't rock your theological world, but it should rock your world. When you see what really concerned people in the ancient days, to me that's exciting, right? And so your question is absolutely pertinent. And it's absolutely what I'm trying to, I'm not trying to form a revolution. I'm trying to actually bring knowledge that as a person, as a kid, I always want to know. What does it really say? And until you learn Greek and you learn classical Greek and you study the history and the culture, you really don't understand. So if anything, that's what I'm trying to do, is boil this down to a point where we can fully comprehend, or comprehend to some degree, what does it say in Hebrews, which is the most complex Bible book it's the most complex book to tell us in the Bible. So when we picked this one, I picked it on purpose. I figured everybody would be ready for it. But this is a very complex logos to tell us. And remember, if you remember the three things. Number one, translations are difficult and they're complex. Number two, what is the cultural, what do the patrons, what did the guys who translate it want from it? And number three, really, we see this all the time, that the differences between what was important in their culture. What's the question? That's what we're at right now. The question, that cannot be denied, right? So I have the ascension sacrifice, I have the sin, the guilt, I have the priest, and I have the Thanksgiving sacrifice. And we know, the rabbi said, in the Messianic era, all you would need is Thanksgiving sacrifice. However, when I have a temple, to get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice, I got to go through the whole thing. So, what we have seen is that there are two groups. There's the Pauline group, and there's the group of the apostles, the apostolic committee, the apostolic synod, whatever that group was in Acts, right? And Paul said, you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. The other group said, no, you can't. So you have a problem. Now, you partially relieve that problem, but then you exacerbate the problem by going to Alexandria. When Jerusalem was wiped, and there's no temple. But I still have the Essenes temple. Here's the Galil, and here's Babylon, and here's Alexandria. The Essenes had a temple, but then they didn't, right? Because Masada and the Essenes are gone. In fact, what probably happened to the Essenes?
Probably joined
The joint notice.
They probably joined Teen Hodos, right on. The ones that were left, they joined Teen Hodos. The ones, that we think, if you look at Acts, maybe I should do Acts sometime again, but Acts is very obvious. Acts was probably written to a high priest, or Acts and Luke. And in Acts and Luke, it says specifically in Acts that many of the priests came to know Christ. In other words, came to Teen Hodos. So there's a segment. I haven't written this up on the board a long time. You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and you have Teen Hodos. There are two other groups that are mentioned by Jerome, but there's no evidence in history of it. And so that's interesting. But Jerome mentions two other groups. And I don't even remember what they are. He's the only guy in history to mention them, and I'm not sure why he mentioned them. They may be offshoots of the others. But we know the Sadducees probably went to Teen Hodos. The Essenes probably went to Teen Hodos, and everybody in the Zealots were wiped out, pretty much. Masada and the Zealots came out of the Essenes and the Pharisees. Now, what did the Pharisees become? These are the synagogue rulers and the rabbis. And so they're very different than the priestly class. And they probably retained, because they were already self-existent, they're also proselytizing this period. They stopped proselytizing after this period. Yes, sir?
Was it the Sadducees that believed in resurrection, and the Pharisees didn't, or was it the
No,
other way
the other way
around?
around.
The other way around.
It's the other way around. The Sadducees were uniquely orthodox, very orthodox, and did not believe in resurrection. They did not hold to the Talmud, and they did not hold to the Mishnah.
That's why they're so sad, you see.
Yes.
Sadducee, that's right.
That's how I
That's the
remember.
way I remember it too. Yeah, the
Orchard's- That's
Sadducee.
Borchard's line, yeah. I'm not smart enough for that. But
What's interesting, in the Pharisees, you have there are three elements today. They call them hazy, crazy, and lazy. Hazy, crazy, and lazy. The crazies are the ones that are orthodox, super orthodox. They probably came from the leftover priests and Cohens. They sure like to have their name Cohen, although we don't think there's much Cohen DNA Cohen means priest. So the hazies are the ones that's the super reformed. So the super reformed are way reformed outside of any orthodoxy. They'll eat ham. They truly don't do kosher at all. And then the lazy are the ones who know the difference. They're the kind of middle group between the two that they know it, but they don't necessarily show it, right? So, they're not really engaged. So it's very interesting, because you see these breakouts and what happened in Christianity. So Teen Hodos is the ones that left. And the question is, all right, how do I do the Thanksgiving sacrifice? If I follow the temple method, I got to go to the temple, right? And the temple's destroyed. So what am I going to do? This is what the Christians in Jerusalem were doing. And by the way, this is why they wanted money. They wanted money. Paul got them money and asked for money, not to support them, but to support the sacrifices they were doing. They were doing the Thanksgiving sacrifice in honor of Jesus Christ through this whole period until the destruction of Jerusalem. After the destruction of Jerusalem, now I got a problem. And I told you before, you could go to a kosher butcher, right? But the problem with a kosher butcher was a kosher butcher supposed to do the Passover lamb? And the Passover lamb originally was how many times a year? Once. So how do I refine this Seder? And how do I refine what I'm doing? And this is a problem for them, among other problems. So they're trying in this, and those in Hebrews, the Hebrew writers, and there's two of them, where I'm almost sure there's at least two, they're trying to give us a logos to telos, that explains and argues why we can do what we are doing. Why does this logically fit? And of course you have the other problem. What is the elephant in the room? The big elephant in the room is still there.
No temple.
Well, there's no temple. That's huge, but that's an obvious, right? But you're right. That's a problem. The big problem is I got Romans, I got Greeks, I got Hebrews, and I got Egyptians. And you still have the circumcision versus uncircumcision group, right? The Apostolic Council and Paul said it doesn't matter if you're circumcised, right? Which made lots of people happy. But guess what happened in the diaspora? The Pharisees were diaspored, and the Pharisees are established. And the Pharisees say what? If you want to be Jew, you got to be circumcised. And Teen Hodos is what? It is a Jewish sect. So you still have this fight. And then you have the other fight, and guess what? Okay, and it resonates to today. This problem resonates to today. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes, all of Hebraic culture say, if you want your sins forgiven, you have to do what? Go to the temple and sacrifice. That's what you got to do. And yet the Christians are saying what? You don't have to go to the temple. The Christians are saying you have to do something, though, and that is Thanksgiving sacrifice. Do you see where this causes cultural difficulties? Because now I'm skipping the whole thing, and I'm going directly to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So how do you argue with Hebrews? And guess what they named this book? To the Hebrews. Pros Hebreus. To the Hebrews. Why to the Hebrews? Because the Hebrews especially, this message is to resonate among all these groups. But the Hebrews are the ones that especially need to hear it because they are the ones who have the greatest change in culture. The Romans, is this a new thing for them? No, you go sacrifice to the gods all the time, right? That's how you get your meat. Cool. The Greeks, that's where you get your meat. Cool. The Egyptians, they didn't have quite as much strong a sacrificial system, but same thing. The Hebrews, Hebrews totally different from the rest of the world. So who do I have to bring into my clan? Who do I have to bring into my logical argument? The Hebrews are the main focus, but like I said, this whole book is not just to the Hebrews. It's recognizably, obviously, to all these groups, but it's a logos to tell us that enables the Hebrews, the Romans, the Greeks, and the Egyptians, and anyone else who wants to pick it up to understand what's going on. That's the whole point. So let's look at, let me see. I'm just going to read the NIV, all right? 18, these have been forgiven, there's no longer any sacrifice for sin. We've already been through this. Therefore, brothers, 19, we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus. So we can enter the most holy place. 20, by a new and living way open to us through the curtain, that is the curtain, that is the curtain, the veil in the temple. And 21, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God. All right, this whole argument, if you take it within the context of the temple in Alexandria, okay, you're having this huge fight. The Pharisees are saying that, okay, the Pharisees The Pharisees that are in Alexandria and the Sadducees in Alexandria are saying what about the temple in Alexandria? Can you sacrifice there?
I think they would want you to.
Well, they would say about Teen Hodos. Can Teen Hodos sacrifice there? Teen Hodos has got Romans and Greeks and Egyptians. Can you sacrifice there? No. You can't go because, remember the court of Gentiles? The Gentiles could not enter past the mezzocline. The Gentiles could not go into the temple area. The Gentiles were not allowed. The Pharisees and Sadducees who are established in Alexandria are saying, yeah, come on to the Hebrews. What are the Pharisees and Sadducees that got kicked out of Jerusalem saying? And Babylon and the Galil. What do they say?
No.
No, you can't. Because it's not in Jerusalem. The Essenes are saying what? If there exist any around. What do the Essenes say? Even though they had an illegal temple, the illegal temple was in, well, the Holy Land, right? And the only reason that they could sacrifice was because the temple in Jerusalem was befouled. An abomination, right? So the Essenes are kind of up in the air. I mean, I don't know where they would really sit. It'd be interesting to talk to them if there was any living. But they would probably say, oh yeah, sure. Ish. Right? The authors tell us, though, that by the blood of Christ, you can enter into the most holy place. There's a most holy place in Alexandria. There's a most holy place in Jerusalem. There's a most holy place in the Essenes. In other words, culturally, they're telling these people, it doesn't matter, right? Because through Jesus Christ, you have the right to enter it. If you have the right to enter the most holy place, you are a priest. If you are a priest, you have the right to eat teruma. You have the right to sacrifice. You have the right to participate in the sacrifice. In other words, you're giving them a logical argument of why they can do either the Pauline or the Apostolic Council's reasoning for sacrifice. In other words, if you go to a kosher butcher to get your seder or to get your lamb or to get your sacrifice right, then you are able to eat it in the Thanksgiving sacrifice because you yourself are consecrating it. And by the way, that's what we do today, right? We don't call them priests, we call them pastors. Anglicans call them priests. Orthodox call them priests. Catholics call them priests. Baptists call them ministers. But what do all of these men do, and women in some cases, but mostly men in our view, what do? They are acting in the place of priests to sanctify, provide the proper words, right, for the Thanksgiving sacrifice. And we do not believe that the words are necessary, right? That's our view. But yet we still have them do it, right? Because that is the argument from Hebrews. We are all priests. And that's one of the reasons we call our guys pastors instead of priests, but in any case. So, let's look at this. In 22, we already parsed 22. Here's the NIV. Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, full of assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. Here's the literal translation I gave you last time. Approach with thoughts, feelings, not false thoughts, feelings, completely persuaded thoughts, feelings, rendered besprinkled, able to see completely hurtful things, and bodies, sarksuke pneuma, baptized, literally, and they use the word lovo, which means to bathe, with clean rainwater, which I told you specifically meant the mikvah. But what I want to do before we go to the 23 is I want you to notice something. It says specifically, approach amid or with thoughts feelings, not false thoughts, feelings. Completely persuaded thoughts, feelings. Rendered, besprinkled, able to see completely. So, three things. In our translation, we get, and let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and a full assurance of faith, having our hearts besprinkled. Let us draw near to God with a sincere. How much more powerful is this the author's trying to tell us? He's not telling us, let us draw near to God. He says, approach with cardia. With, the cardia is the center of your suke. Your suke. Suke is the thoughts, feelings. So approach with your suke, your mind, not false thoughts and feelings. Suke, right? Not false. Completely persuaded. And it's not the feelings. The most important part of the persuasion is what?
Thoughts.
Your mind. Yeah, your thoughts are persuaded. We are big feeling people. Oh, how do you feel? I'm a feeling, right? My feelings. Don't hurt my feelings, right? But the Greeks didn't care much about feelings. They thought they were an offspring of your thoughts, and they were worried about your thoughts. And that's what the New Testament is really concerned with, is your thoughts. The thoughts drive your feelings. So approach with thoughts, feelings, not false thoughts, feelings. Completely persuaded thoughts, feelings. Rendered, besprinkled, and the besprinkled appeals back to, what's besprinkled?
Baptism or
Even before that. Well, the high priest does what with the sacrifice? He sprinkles the blood in the holy place, the most holy place, right? To purify, not God, but for the purification of the people. So this is a reference back, and the reference again that your body is able to see completely hurtful things, and bodies cleaned with rainwater, baptized with rainwater. So we get to that, and I didn't write it on the board, I should. We have cleanliness, we have antinomia, and we have miss the mark. I do not want you ever to look at that again, especially in Hebrews, and not be able to parse this out, because it's critical to understand the sacrifices and what they mean. And the author here is telling us, that the cleanliness is a required thing. You notice cleanliness? The cleanliness goes back to this. So you can eat teruma. That's baptism. The besprinkled goes back to this. Antinomia, right? What can do for miss the mark? There is no sacrifice for miss the mark. And our author told us that. They're going to get into even more detail. There's no sacrifice for miss the mark. It doesn't mean it's not fixed in Jesus Christ, right? In Jesus Christ, miss the mark is fixed. But there's no sacrifice for miss the mark. This is important. This is a very important point of Hebrews, I think. Very important point. Let's look at 23. So 23 says in the NIV, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. That's not exactly what it says. Let's parse this. Let us hold fast. It's literally kateko, to hold fast. So I'll go for that, to hold fast. Hold fast, hold down, kateko. Echo means to hold, and kata means down. So down, hold fast. The homologia, at the same logical argument, literally at the same time agree to a logical argument. So profession is okay, a little bit advanced within the concept. Homologia doesn't exactly mean profession. We talked about that. Of is ho, ours added, elpis, not our faith, our hope. The NIV has it right. The King James translated faith instead of hope. Elpis, the anticipation, without wavering, alkenes, not leaning. Acklings, not leaning. 4, gar, assigning a reason. Whenever you see gar in the context, that's a logical argument. Assigning a reason, he is pistos, not faithful, he is pistos. He has been convinced by a logical argument that apangelio. Remember this word? I think I put it as a word of the day, maybe a word, well I had it marked here, but I didn't give it to a word of the day. EP, a little darker, this is maybe darker. Epangelo. Remember that word? Epi,
The message of the gods.
the message of the gods, yes. Which we translate usually as gospel, which remember at the beginning of Hebrews was translated as the message of angels. Right? And I made a huge thing about that why are they taking this word and all of a sudden they translate it, at the beginning it's the message from the angels, the message from this, that, the other thing. And the evangelio means literally the gospel. It means the message, it means the good message, well, the not good message, but the message from the gods. And the angelio doesn't necessarily mean an angel. It means a pastor or a person or whatever, whoever's conveying the message. It's the message of the gods. Period. Dot. So look what they did. They just translated it as promise. It's promise. Here's the literal. Let us hold fast at the same time, agree to a logical argument, the hope, not leaning, assigning a reason he has been convinced by a logical argument announced by the angels. Or announced by the angels is okay. Here's the translation. Let us hold fast to the logical argument that convinced us in the past, the unwavering hope that he announced through his messengers, his logical argument. That is what this is what this verse is saying. Let us hold fast to the logical argument that convinced us in the past, the unwavering hope that he announced through his messengers, his logical argument. This is very different than, let us hold unswavering to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. I mean, you can kind of tease that out, right? Kind of tease that out. This is like a call to a pronouncement of an assent of a creed almost. It is a announcement that is basically saying we are holding, the message from the very beginning of Hebrews is this is a message from the gods. This is a message from God, right? Theos, the Theos, O Theos. So the point is that, I'll read it again. Let us hold fast to the logical argument that convinced us in the past, the unwavering hope that he announced through his messengers, his logical argument. Goes on. Let's look at 24. Gotta get past all my translation notes. Here's an idea. Let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Let's parse it. And, kai, that's correct. Let us consider kataneo, to down exercise the mind, which is pretty close. Let us down exercise the mind. One another, aleon, one another. To, ice, provoke unto. Paraxomos, to near keen, incitement. Paraxomos, there's a couple of words in English that are pretty close, but paraxum, right? A paraxum, that'd be to a near keen, to an incitement. Agape, the love of the gods. And two is added, kale, beautiful. It's not good, it's beautiful works. Ergon, beautiful toil. So here's the translation. And let us exercise the mind one another to near keen, to incite love of the gods and beautiful toil. And a translation. Let us exercise the mind with one another to incite love like God and beautiful efforts. Love like God and beautiful efforts. So tie that. I mean, you can't separate this, right? You cannot separate this one from another. These are all logical arguments that lead down the same point. So let us hold fast to the logical argument that convinced us in the past, the unwavering hope he announced through his messengers, his logical argument. let us exercise the mind with one another to incite love like God and beautiful efforts. So what's the message of the gospel? We've been talking about, right, the sacrifice of Christ and what that means. But the gospel is about, let us hold fast to the logical argument that convinced us in the past, the unwavering hope that he announced through his messengers, his logical argument. Therefore, what are we going to do with the message?
We have to think about it, and we have to share it with other people.
Bingo! Let us exercise the mind with one another to incite love like God and beautiful efforts. Continue. 25. And here's a very interesting one. I think this is interesting because you're going to find out how convoluted the translation is. Here's the NIV. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Here's the parse. Me is lest. It's not, it's lest. Lest, eg katalipo. To leave behind in some place. Literally, forsaking, to leave behind in some place. The episynagoga. The episynagoga. Literally a complete collection. Synagogue comes from the Greek. Episynagogue means a complete collection. I just want to mention this. What do you think a complete collection is? If a synagogue is the Hebrews, right? Then a episynagogue is all the believers, right? In Teen Hodos. Which I think is very interesting, because you remember what happened in Corinth, right? And it's probably happening here. So, all the people came from Jerusalem. A lot of Teen Hodos came from Jerusalem, right? There are Sadducees, there's Pharisees, there's Essenes, there's remaining Zealots, there's Teen Hodos. And they all came to Alexandria. And where's the first place they went? Well, probably to the synagogue, right? Because the synagogue, they come every Sunday. You only go to the temple to sacrifice. Now, Teen Hodos was sacrificing every day in the temple. That's what it tells us in Acts. So what's the first question they have when they get to Alexandria? Can we continue? So where's the first place they go? What did the Apostolic Fathers tell them to do?
Go to synagogue for instruction.
Go to synagogues. Exactly. So they went to the synagogue. In the synagogue, Teen Hodos also had Romans, Greeks, probably by this time Egyptians, right?
Yeah.
And they all came together. And what happened when they went to the synagogue? There were some synagogues where they said, oh, that's cool, come on in. But what do you think most synagogues said?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Especially you Romans, Greeks. Now the Egyptians are circumcised. So you might be able to come in, right? But you're not Hebrews. The Hebrews could come in, but not the Greeks and the Romans. They're pitched out. So what do you have to have? An episynagogue. You have to have an episynagogue to take care of those that are there. That means you had to have probably a changed Pharisee, or a Teen Hodos Pharisee, right? Like who? Who's our famous Teen Hodos Pharisee?
Paul.
Paul! Yeah, old Paul, Saul of Tarsus, right? He called himself Saul when he was with the Greeks. He called himself Paul when he was with the Romans, or with the Hebrews. Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee who was converted to Teen Hodos, who became a Teen Hodos member. So guess what he'd say in his synagogue, if he had one? Come on down, right? Come on down. But, we know that it may not be rare. Matter of fact, it may be becoming more and more, right, common. It could be. I don't know. We don't have any real data. But this is what they say in Hebrews. So, together, a complete collection as kathos, it's kathos, just down. Down which how? Just as. The is added, ethos, a usage of some person, tis is the word, is added, a la other things, exhorting, parakleo, exhorting, parakleo. Parakleo means to call near. Remember, that's that word that Paul used all the time, parakleo. And by the way, and I haven't used the word in a long time, ecclesia. Ecclesia, that means, that's the Roman, that's the Greek.
Democracy, is that what that?
Yeah, the Athenian democracy, but that's the same word we use for church. A called group, an ecclesia. So, called near is parakleo, which, when the minute I say parakleo in the Greek, you should automatically think of ecclesia. And by the way, that's what the Orthodox still call their churches. We call ours churches. Added, and kai, so much, tosotos, so vast is this, the is added, malon, more, as hosos, as much as ye see blepo, to look at, hemera, this is kind of complicated, right? Approaching, exio, to make near. Literally, exio means near enough to throttle. I mean, you love the Greeks, right? So, in other words, exio means that something is near enough to grab a hold of it by the neck. You know, that's their thing, right? Exio. So, here's the literal translation. I know this is really confusing. I'm telling you, this is a problem with Hebrews and the complexity. Lest leaving behind in some place, in down leave, the complete collection over together lead of ourselves, just as down which how, a usage of some persons, other things call us near, and so vast as this more, as much as we look at the day is made near, in the sense of near enough to throttle. This is one of those, I was telling you, right? You get these very complex Greek arguments, and then I try to turn them into an English translation. I get, let us not be out meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day is approaching. Here's what, I'll translate this from the Greek in a meaningful way. Lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue, the leading together, the complete synagogue of ourselves, just as a usage of some persons, other things call us near. And so vast as this more, as much as we look at the day, comes near us to do something about. Okay, maybe that's a little complex. Let's parse a little bit. Lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue. Lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of ourselves. So, lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of ourselves. In other words, they are meeting in the episynagogue, right? They're meeting together. What do you think this group in the episynagogue is? They're happy. It's like us, right? When you go to church, well, I hope when you go to church, you're happy to see people. You're happy to go through, what we do in church. So when you went to the episynagogue and you saw your neighbors and your friends and all the people from Twin Hodos, you're like, this is great, this is great. But look what it says. Least leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of ourselves. The problem with that is the previous verse, the previous statement was what? We don't want to stop.
Meeting.
What's that?
Meeting.
No, that's what it says in the NIV. But the previous verse says we don't want to stop the message of the gospel. Right? The message of the gospel is the most important thing. Right? That's what... let me dig back. In 24. Let us exercise the mind with one another to incite love like God in beautiful efforts. What are the beautiful efforts? Look at 24 or 23. 23, the beautiful efforts are this. Let us hold fast to the logical argument that convinced us in the past and unwavering hope that he announced through his messengers. His logical argument. Who are the messengers? Ushers, all these people in the episynagogue are the messengers. But what happens if you're sitting in the episynagogue?
You're in an echo chamber.
You're in an echo chamber. Not only that, it says in 24, it says, let us exercise the mind with one another to incite love like God and beautiful efforts. What's beautiful efforts? The beautiful efforts, are there any beautiful efforts? Okay. You got to think about this. Are there any beautiful efforts going on here? I mean, there's beautiful things we do, and we worship God and we prepare, but where are the beautiful efforts?
Out in the mission field.
Yeah, you notice our church has a sign that says you're earning the mission field? The beautiful efforts don't happen here. They happen out there where you're actually in communication with people. And that's the whole point of this, right? So it goes on. Lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue. In other words, we are meeting in the episynagogue and we don't want to leave, but we've got to do what? We got to share the message. Just as a usage of some persons. So there's some persons who are obviously not, okay, we'll look at this a little further, but think about this. The problem they have is I think they become slightly introverted within their own group, because that is kind of the message of the Hebrews, right? From the very beginning. Get out, talk to your neighbor. Get out, ask your neighbor questions. Get out, right? And so we are seeing that now put into a legal and argument about the sacrifice. So I think this is a really important point that the authors are trying to make to us. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. Take care of us in your name we pray.
Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas.